Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Julia Galef. She's the host of the popular Rationally Speaking podcast, where she's interviewed thinkers such as Tyler Cohen, Sean Carroll, Phil Tetlock, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. She's an advisor to OpenAI, works with the Open Philanthropy Project, and co-founded the Center for Applied Rationality. Her 2016 TED Talk, Why You Think You're Right Even If You're Wrong, is viewed over 4 million times. I think it's over 5 million now. Anyway, her new book is The Scout Mindset, Why Some People See Things Clearly and Others Don't. So we go through what she means by this metaphor of a scout mindset or a soldier mindset, and I read through the characteristics of that in the podcast. We talk about Dan Kahneman's thinking fast and slow as another metaphor and how that applies to that. We talk about how to talk to people that you disagree with or that differ from you. And then we drill down on a bunch of different issues, like empirical claims and like climate science or vaccines or whatever, and how those differ from religious beliefs and political beliefs and ideological beliefs. And then we end with my challenging her to explain to President Biden how he would structure a room full of Arabs and Israelis in a conference to solve the Middle East conflict. That would be a hard one. And she's got a really good answer to that. Your subtitle is, why some people see things clearly and others don't. Of course, part of the problem is nobody thinks they don't see things clearly. I had Michael Gordon on the podcast who wrote this book on science and pseudoscience and the demarcation problem. Mm-hmm. And my favorite quote from him is, no one in the history of the world has ever self-identified as a pseudoscientist. Gets up in the morning and thinks, I'm going to go down to my pseudo lab and collect some pseudo facts, support my pseudo theory.
Right.
Everybody thinks
they're
doing science. I have good science. You're the one you're the wrong skeptic. Your skepticism should go in the other direction. Right. So that's part of the problem.
Have you ever heard the definition of irrationality as the study of how other people think?
That's right. Yeah, right. Not me.
Anyway, that is often in the back of my mind. So one thing I'll say is that I think people are of multiple minds when it comes to, how accurate their thinking is or whether they want to see things accurately. To some extent, of course, if you ask people like, do you think you're, you perceive things accurately, they'll, for the most part say, yes, of course. And yes, I want to. And so they'll sort of endorse the idea of what I'm calling scout mindset in theory, or at least most people will. Some people actually, there's a scale, it's called actively open-minded thinking, developed by the psychologist John Barron, who I'm sure you've heard of. And it's just a measure of essentially what is your view of what good thinking entails. And so it has questions like, when you encounter evidence that contradicts your views, should you change your mind? And should you try to understand opposing perspectives? And so you would think, well, of course, everyone would say yes to these questions. They may not practice it, in practice, but of course they'd endorse those questions. But actually not everyone does. Some people say, no, you should never change your mind. You should stick to your guns. And I guess, these are people who value kind of maybe loyalty or steadfastness more than they value truth. So there is some difference even on this question of, in theory, should we be trying to perceive things accurately? But then, of course, there's also way more difference in practice and how much people live up to these ideals of truth-seeking. And so that was sort of more what I was focused on was to what extent are we living up to these ideals and trying to motivate people to want to live up to them more.
Yeah, let me just read from my review of your book, mostly quoting you. Distinguishing the scout mindset and soldier mindset. Soldiers rationalize, deny, deceive, and self-deceive and engage in motivated reasoning and wishful thinking in order to win the battle of ideas. Now quoting you. We talk about our beliefs as if they're military positions or even fortresses built to resist attack. Beliefs can be deep-rooted, well-grounded, built on fact, backed up by arguments. They rest on solid foundations. We might hold a firm conviction or a strong opinion and be secure in our convictions and have unshakable faith in something. The soldier mindset leads us to defend.
I really
against...
like your...
Yeah. Yeah.
I like your dramatic reenactment of my words.
Yes, maybe I'll read this review audio before as a preface to this podcast. And we defend against people who might poke holes in our logic, shoot down our beliefs, and confront us with a knockdown argument, all of which maybe our beliefs are undermined, weakened, or even destroyed, so we become entrenched in them lest we surrender. to the opposing position. Okay, so let me just stop right there. What if you're right? Like, for example, let's say I'm defending the theory of evolution against some, wackadoodle young Earth creationists that think the universe was invented 10,000 years ago by the creator of the universe, right around the time the Babylonians invented beer. This is just crazy. Why would I be open-minded? And, I could be wrong. Who knows? Darwin, maybe not. It's 50-50.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense. I know I'm right. We know evolution is true. I mean, to the extent that science can prove anything, not 100%, but, So why wouldn't I defend that?
Yes. Great question. So I would say that there's a big spectrum of how confident you can justifiably be in your position on a particular issue. So on some things, I think you can justifiably be quite confident, and it would be kind of false modesty or false, epistemic humility to say, like, well, I really don't know if this is true. I'm still very open to other perspectives if the question is like, is the Earth flat or not? And so you're right. Yes, on some things, like, you can and should be quite confident in what the right answer is. The big caveat I'll give is that, I think people often go straight to these kind of more extreme cases where they really, the right answer is pretty clear. And they sometimes use that as an excuse to not deal with the much muddier cases. Because I think there are a lot of muddy cases where, it's complicated enough that you should actually have a fair amount of uncertainty about the right answer. And so I don't want the existence of the relatively clear-cut cases to detract from the very real and often very important, messy gray area cases. And then the other caveat I wanted to add to my answer is that I think there's a difference between being certain that someone else is wrong and being certain that your view is 100% right. And people often conflate those two. And so they'll hear, they'll listen to a critic of their perspective and they'll go, wow, that person is clearly wrong. And they're right. The critic is wrong. But that doesn't actually mean that their view is 100% right. Because it's not like, if you're 90% wrong, or it's not like our two views must add up to 100%. Like, what's more often the case is that I'm, maybe I'm more right than you. Maybe I'm like 60% right and you're only 5% right. But all of us are still, significantly wrong about a lot of things. Like on the question of evolution, for example, the young Earth creationist is wrong, but, your model of how evolution works might still have holes in it. You might still be, unduly confident about how much evidence we have for pieces of the model of evolution. And it's easy to fall into the trap of insisting that, all of the pieces of the model are 100% certain just because, well, the other side is clearly wrong. But that doesn't mean that your view of things is 100% right. And it's good to be aware of that. So I spent a while thinking about why some people are so much more willing to, notice and acknowledge that they were wrong about something than other people are. And I think that a large piece of the puzzle is just the kind of the assumptions that we have about what it means to have been wrong. And a lot of people, maybe the majority of people, I think implicitly feel like if I was wrong, that means I failed in some way. I was stupid, or I was careless, or I was stubborn or something. And so that's why it's so aversive to recognize that they were wrong, and that's why they fight it. And in some cases, I think being wrong means you did something wrong. But in many, maybe the majority of cases, no, you didn't do anything wrong. Like the views you held were completely reasonable given the information you had at the time, or given the amount of time that it made sense to spend thinking about it. Like, we even the smartest human in the world, the best educated person has limited time and processing power. And so, the conclusions you form are always going to be kind of rough sketches of the truth. And so, of course, your map of the world is going to have a bunch of, areas that need to be revised as you learn new information. That does not mean you failed in any way. And one reason I kind of emphasize this point in the book is that I feel like even people who are kind of on my side, like the other advocates of truth seeking and intellectual honesty and changing your mind, the way that they advocate that, I feel like often doesn't really help very much, because they'll say things like, it's okay to admit that you were wrong. We're all human. We all make mistakes. And
Right.
and I see what they're going for. Like I don't mean to criticize, but it still sounds like, it sounds like, yeah, you screwed up, but it's okay. No one's perfect. And, don't beat yourself up. It essentially, it sounds like, yes, you failed, but that's okay. Failure is human. And
Right.
and I want to challenge even that premise. No, I don't think you failed. I think you did, in most of the cases when you were wrong, I think you did everything right. But, you still need to update when you get new information. And that's why I said that thing about like an update in the Bayesian sense. It's not an admission of guilt or failure or anything. It just means you got new information, you incorporated it, and you revised your model, and now it's more accurate, and that's good. But that doesn't mean you were wrong to have the previous model. That's a pattern that it's a strong pattern I've noticed in, who's happy to change their mind and who isn't. A lot of it comes down to how they think about what it means to have been wrong. I mean, the incentives that you face can shape whether you're more inclined towards scout mindset or soldier mindset on a particular topic. And certainly in most areas of punditry, the incentive is not to be a scout. It's to, say things that play to the biases and the values of their listeners, and to kind of beat down the other side, often in unfair ways, but that's what their audience wants to hear. And they're not going to get any particular, benefit or reward from saying they were wrong about something or adding nuance. So that is true. Again, to add a caveat to that, I would say there are exceptions. Sorry, go on. The caveat I'll add to that is that there are some exceptions. There are pundits who they're not playing to the broadest audience possible. They're optimizing for a smaller, somewhat more niche, but still often sizable audience that does value, like, takes changing one's mind or ability, being able to portray the other side fairly and honestly, takes those as sort of, things to admire. There are some pundits like that, some public intellectuals who I can name. And then the other thing I would say is that again, I think people often focus on kind of the worst offenders, like, the Sean Hannitys or like other people on Fox News, or I don't know, on all sides of the political spectrum, there are demagogues. And they explicitly or implicitly feel like, well, if other people aren't going to be, truth-seeking, then I'm not going to bother either. And I think they're sort of taking the worst examples of the other side and using that as an excuse to be like, well, no one's doing this, so I'm not going to either. But you could instead be looking at kind of the shining examples of, people who are being intellectually honest, even though they don't have to, or even though they could get rewarded for not doing it. And you could, use those as your role models instead of the terrible examples. Tweets about politics that go viral is just a depressing, barren wasteland. So I get a little concerned, actually, if one of my tweets gets an unusually large number of clicks. It causes me to doubt myself. I'm like, oh God, was I being unreasonable? So one reaction is that I think some religious claims are, they are empirical propositions, and there are people who have tried to, collect evidence for that, or tried to, think about how strong the evidence is for those empirical claims, and some of them have in fact concluded, actually, there's really not that much evidence for this, or the evidence is a lot more contradictory than I thought, and they do change their minds. It doesn't happen that often, but I think some religious claims really do fall under this category of, they're empirical, and they can have more or less support. And if you're trying, you can start to notice how much or little their support they have. That said, there are other claims that are it's much less clear, like, what it would mean for them to be true, and so value judgments, for example, or views about what kind of world we should be fighting for, or about how to behave ethically. It's much dicier to define, like, what would it mean for you to be right or wrong about that claim. And so I kind of avoided talking about this in the book just because it felt like it was going to be too much of a philosophical thicket to get into. But my like nutshell account of how you would, like, be a scout about those more moral questions is just to try to think about them as objectively as possible, which I would define as you can do, like, thought experiments of the type I talk about in the book, where you sort of test your intuitions to see if, well, I have this moral principle that I'm invoking now that, like, I don't know, maybe the moral principle is adultery is, someone's own business. It doesn't, like, we're not to judge or something. So maybe you feel like that's your moral principle. You could test the objectivity of that by imagining that, a politician on the other side of the aisle committed adultery. What would your reaction be then? Would you still feel like upholding this moral principle? And so you can do thought experiments to test the kind of intellectual consistency of your moral values. And that's different from testing the truth of the moral values, but I think it's still an important part. It's kind of the best you can do when it comes to trying to be a scout about about morals and values. Well, that, and you can try to be truth-seeking about the empirical questions that bear on the moral values. Like if you feel like, well, it's fine to eat meat because animals can't really suffer anyway. That's an empirical question. So your moral judgment might change if you kind of more proactively went out and tried to collect the best evidence you can about whether animals can in fact suffer and whether they do in fact suffer in factory farms. So anyway, I think there are ways to be a better or worse scout about moral questions, even though, a moral question being true or false is kind of hard to define philosophically. Another thing that I think you can often do in these conversations, and that's like a good thing to have in mind in any disagreement where you're, to avoid just, being overly confident that you're right, is that you can have degrees of confidence in your premises. And even on moral questions like, is a fetus a moral, in philosophy they use this phrase, a moral patient, which just means a being who we should be concerned about morally, who, deserves consideration in terms of whether we, violate its rights or cause it suffering or things like that. And so there are genuine philosophical questions about, like, are animals moral patients? Some people think there are genuine moral questions about, are babies moral patients and in what sense, et cetera. And so the question of, is a fetus a moral patient? I give an example in my book, actually, of a journalist and a friend of mine named Kelsey Piper, who writes for Vox's Future Perfect, who I think is a wonderful role model of scout mindset in many ways, like an outlier in I was going to say in journalism, but like in society in general. I really respect her. Anyway, so she was friends with so Kelsey's an atheist and pro-choice, and a friend of hers is a pro-life Catholic, and she had a lot of conversations with her friend about abortion. And it's not like Kelsey changed her mind, became pro-life, but one kind of update she made to her map of reality of the issue after talking to her friend for a while was that she decided, I really can't be 100% certain that fetuses aren't moral patients. I feel pretty sure that they're not in all the ways that it makes sense to me to define moral patient in terms of, consciousness and ability to suffer and so on, like complexity of the mind. It seems pretty clear they're not moral patients who we shouldn't worry about, violating their rights. But I'm not 100% sure. And I think the question of who counts as a moral patient is actually kind of complicated, and we should have some error bars around who we decide is or isn't a moral patient. And so, yeah, so she came away from those conversations with a little bit more uncertainty. And in terms of like the policy implications of that uncertainty, maybe you want to like try a little harder to prevent totally unnecessary abortions, or to like reduce the number of abortions that happen if you have a little bit more uncertainty about the moral patienthood of the fetus. You can believe both that everyone would be better off under democracy than alternatives, but also believe that people would not be better off with externally imposed democracy, and that the consequences of externally opposed attempts at imposing democracy are likely to be worse than the non-democracy status quo. That's you say it comes down to these conflicting values of not infringing on individuals' autonomy to choose the life that they want for themselves, and not presuming that you know better than they do about what will make them happy, or has to be combined with consideration of the value of, what about the welfare of people who were either forced into it or who were in situations where they couldn't really freely make a choice, the best of our guess. And to me, a lot of it just comes down to the numbers, like our best estimates of, what percent of women in sex work seem to have chosen it voluntarily and don't seem to be coerced into staying in it, versus the percentage of women who are, at least this is the crux for me, is like, I could imagine finding out that, 90% of women in sex work were actually coerced into it, and only 10% are in the sort of free, voluntary, yes, I'm happy with my choices category. And in that world, I probably, even though I really do value individual autonomy, but that ratio would be probably lopsided enough that I'd say, well, I think unless we can find some way to distinguish, maybe we can. But if we can't, then I would sacrifice the autonomy of those 10% of women in exchange for helping the 90% of women. And I don't know what ratio would be the tipping point for me, if it would be like 60-40 or I'm not sure. I haven't done those thought experiments yet. But I feel like these discussions of the magnitudes are often absent in these kinds of conversations, and people, not you, but like often when people, argue for one side or the other of these issues, they're just focused on the case that sort of they care the most about or that they suspect is the most prevalent. So they'll just focus on the women who are, being coerced or abused, or they'll just focus on the sex workers who chose this freely and, don't want that choice taken away from them. And they just kind of ignore the question of like, well, how common is that compared to the other scenario? So I wish these conversations included more discussion of, our best guesses of magnitudes, essentially. The argument that it degrades you as a person to engage in sex work, and that this is just something that other people can judge. Like, well, of course it degrades you. You may not think it does. You may claim that, you enjoy it or you feel empowered or you don't feel degraded at all, but I can tell that it degrades you, and therefore we shouldn't let you degrade yourself. And that drives me batty because it feels like, just this very subjective intuition people have about what's degrading or what's not, that they're treating as a, universal objective truth as opposed to just their own personal subjective intuition. And I can think of plenty of things that I would find more degrading than sex work, but, or like more dangerous or more, there's just so many like very squishy arguments made about like, well, your body is being used without, consideration for your mind or your worth as a person or something. I can kind of understand how people feel it's different because we have a lot of baggage as a culture about sex. And also some people just emotionally, they do feel more degraded by, being objectified sexually than being objectified in non-sexual ways. But I wish they would acknowledge that that's not universal. Debate between, to simplify, Dan Kahneman on one hand and Gerd Gigerenzer on the other. I'm not sure how much they actually disagree. Okay, they definitely disagree to some extent about some of the experiments that have been used to show irrationality. So Gigerenzer has objected that, I'm not going to recall the specifics right now, but basically that like people were being asked questions in really unnatural ways. And so the answers they give are wrong, but that's because you asked the question in a weird way. If you asked it in a much more natural way, they would get the right answer. So that is a like genuine disagreement over, how much do these experiments really show? But I think that if you take that away, and just focus on the experiments that Kahneman and Gigerenzer agree are meaningful, there's still they still appear to disagree over whether those experiments really do show that people are irrational or not. And Kahneman's case is very simply that, look, people systematically get the wrong answers. They, systematically, well, a good example here would be the question where people are asked, okay, which is more likely? Here's a hypothetical person named Barbara who, attends a lot of women's rights protests and like doesn't shave her legs, or I don't remember if that was in there, but something like that. And, like buys all environmental products. Which is more likely that Barbara is a bank teller, or that Barbara is a bank teller and a feminist? And people, overwhelmingly say, oh, it's much more likely that she's a bank teller and a feminist than that she's just a bank teller. And that is, it's logically impossible for it to be more probable, for the latter to be more probable, because it's two conditions instead of one. It has to be a subset probabilistically of just a bank teller without the additional feminist criterion. People get it wrong because we are thinking kind of associationally, and we hear, feminist, and we're like, oh, that matches these, anecdotes, these facts that we know about Barbara. Anyway, so Kahneman, will point to things like this and say, clearly, like the human brain is irrational in that it systematically gets a bunch of problems like these wrong. And Gigerenzer will reply like, but we shouldn't call people irrational because our brains evolved to solve a certain kind of problem that we were likely to encounter in our ancestral environment. And abstract probabilities were not the kind of thing that we encountered in our ancestral environment. That's like a very modern kind of artificial construct. And so, we shouldn't blame humans for not getting the right answer to those problems. We do very well on problems that are framed in the kind of natural way that we would have encountered in our ancestral environment. To me, I'm not sure they actually disagree. As far as I can tell, and I've checked this with a bunch of economists, behavioral economists, and evolutionary psychologists, and the overwhelming response I've gotten is, yeah, that seems kind of true. As far as I can tell, they agree about the fact that humans get these problems wrong, and so they will, get a bunch of modern questions wrong, and also that, humans are very good at solving problems that are very similar to the ones that we would have encountered in our evolutionary history. And the disagreement, as far as I can tell, is just about, should we call that irrational or not? And Kahneman is using the word irrational to just mean, systematically errors on some problems. And for Gigerenzer, as far as I can tell, he takes the word irrational to have a kind of judgment in it, like you should feel bad about the fact that you have this feature of your brain. And that's why he keeps defending humans by saying, but we evolved for a certain purpose. But I don't think Kahneman disagrees with that at all. I think he's just using the word irrational in a much more sort of technical, limited sense and not in a judgy sense. It's not just on abstract logic puzzles like the Weyson selection test that people get that wrong and they just seek to confirm their hypotheses. It's also in real life cases that aren't, as explicitly about enforcing a rule as the drinking case. Like, I've been reading some red pill stuff lately, the subculture that is focused on, I guess it's black pill stuff. Anyway, the subculture online that's focused on how women are completely superficial and only interested in, men who are tall and muscular. And, if you're not those things, then your life is meaningless and you'll never find love. And anyway, so I'm just so curious about how because as far as I can tell, they're just willfully ignoring the massive amounts of, real world data that disconfirms their model. They're not complete. There's a seed of the thing there that they are correctly perceiving, but they're blowing it up into this absolute rule where no woman will ever date, or ever be genuinely attracted to a man who isn't, over 6 feet and muscular. I'm just like, have you looked around the world? You're
right.
Vastly oversimplifying. Anyway, so I went on this tangent to say that one pattern of reasoning I see a lot in communities like this is never trying to disconfirm that hypothesis and only looking for confirmatory examples, and kind of feeling like they're testing the theory by looking at examples, but only looking for they'll only look for tall muscular men, be like, are women attracted to them? Yes, well, okay, but they never try to look for examples where the men aren't tall and muscular and women are attracted to them, and there are definitely cases of that, many. Anyway, so I think Tubi and Cosmides, who you mentioned, are right to point out that look, there's some cases in which we're really good at disconfirming rules, but at the same time, there's also a lot of cases in which we still fall into the trap of only searching for confirmatory examples. So, I would still call that irrationality while withholding judgment, because I don't think it's our fault that our brains work this way, but I think it still deserves to be called irrational in the sense of systematically getting things wrong. I think I underestimated how much the word rationality or irrationality would cause this defensive or combative reaction in people, and how much associations people already had with it that would just be impossible to separate. And so that's one reason I talk about, scout mindset or soldier mindset or accuracy or inaccuracy instead of rational and irrational in the book.
These are proxy truths. They stand for something else, a deeper kind of truth. I'm on the red team, and so if I talk you out of believing that the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria has a pedophile ring in it, I mean, did you really believe that? Well, one guy did. He went there with his gun, right? And he was surprised that there was no basement. Yeah. And then he shot up the ceiling. No one was hurt. He went to jail. But most people don't
definitely
actually
he's
believe
demonstrating a genuine belief there.
Yes,
as opposed
yes,
to
he really believed. I mean, most people.
Well, I don't know about this, but my guess would be that you would find the most endorsement of very implausible things in kind of public polls or situations where the person professing belief is kind of speaking to outsiders. So they're kind of repping their team in a way, and it's especially important to kind of endorse the thing that is associated with your team, and that we'd see a different pattern of belief if it were a somehow a private poll or some private test that didn't involve, making your team look good or bad to outsiders. So that's I'm skeptical of a lot of poll results on. I'm skeptical of poll results for many reasons, but one of the reasons, especially on politically fraught questions, is that it's just hard to know how much is like people reporting genuine belief versus people, saying the thing that they happen to remember means their tribe is right and the other tribe is wrong. Policy questions, often you really want to get at the former of like, what do people actually believe and value, separate from what they want to cheer for or boo. Entangled with all of this is a question of which sources people trust. And that's not necessarily about tribalism or motivated reasoning. That can be, you can be perfectly rational and come to completely wrong and to other people crazy conclusions if, you just, the path of updating that you took involved, early on having reason to believe that certain sources are trustworthy and you should trust them when they tell you that scientists are lying. And so it can be a valuable exercise. I try to do a lot of asking myself, like, this thing that it seems crazy for someone to believe, can I envision a path by which someone could, like a reasonable person who is updating reasonably, can I envision a path by which they could come to believe it? And usually that path goes through, getting unfortunately misguided advice about which sources are credible and which aren't. So the outsider test is one of a set of thought experiments that I talk about in the book as ways to kind of test your judgments for objectivity, for scout mindset. So the outsider test is essentially just imagining that that someone else is in the situation that you're in, and then noticing how you would, what you think they should do, or how you would evaluate their actions if it was someone else and not you. And so, a simple example of this might be, say you're a manager and there's an employee who's been just performing terribly for months, but you really don't want to fire him. And so you're coming up with reasons why, like, well, maybe if I wait another month, he'll, improve. Or maybe if I just gave him this kind of push, he'll improve or something. Maybe that's true. Or maybe you're rationalizing and you actually should fire the person. So you can do an outsider test and just imagine, okay, suppose, my friend's a manager. Suppose he came to me and told me about this employee who had, made these mistakes over this length of time. Would I think he should give that person another chance? And I'm using this example because I spoke to a bunch of managers who told me the same version of this, or like different versions of the same story, where they kind of did this thought experiment, or in some cases actually talked to another person who had gone through the same situation, and they noticed, oh, wow, if it was someone else who had to fire the person, it would be clear to me that, like, yeah, you got to let this person go. They're not going to get better and they're holding everyone back. But it's just, so all you're changing is who is the person in the story? Is it me or is it someone else? And your reactions can be very different. For example, like the double standard test, or can be used in political contexts, where, like, your politician does something that you think is fine and, people should stop getting on his case. And you imagine, well, if someone from the other side had done that, how would I react? Would I still think it was fine, or would I be calling for his head and, saying that's a impeachable offense? So these are just examples in this category of thought experiments that can help you notice, because it's very, soldier mindset is very invisible from the inside. You just feel like you're being reasonable and objective and, a critical thinker, and you don't really notice how much you're kind of twisting shoehorning the facts into one narrative, or how much you're, bending over backwards to justify something that you otherwise wouldn't. You don't notice that until you kind of do this comparison to the counterfactual where, it's the other side, or it's, a conclusion that's not favorable to me, and then notice that you would be tempted to reason differently in that counterfactual world. So I like thought experiments, partly just on the object level, like they can help me think more clearly about a particular thing, but also because they, doing thought experiments helps drive home to me that my brain is really good at picking and choosing criteria or principles depending on the outcome that I want to get. That's a good thing to realize about your brain, I think. Surely, if everyone did this thought experiment of the veil of ignorance and they didn't know what role or what, like, socioeconomic rank of society they were going to be born into, surely everyone would conclude, oh, well, then we want a society that's as equal as possible. So I minimize the chance of being poorer than average, or being really poor. that was his to him, that was like, well, obviously everyone would conclude this. But actually, no, people have very different like attitudes about risk, for example. And some people are more risk seeking than Rawls apparently was. And they would say, no, I'd rather, have a like 30% chance of being better off and a 30% chance of being poorer off. I prefer that gamble to the certainty of being exactly equal to everyone. And it just comes down to your individual preferences. So I just thought that was so funny that he had the kind of abstract reasoning prowess to design this thought experiment, but then he failed at the point where he was like, well, of course, everyone will conclude such and such. I was just going to say an additional counter argument that I often hear that kind of holds, even if you think that there's no systemic racism at all. An additional counter argument is like, well, people are, some people are lucky enough to be born, smarter or more conscientious than others, and some people are, lucky enough to be born into families that like teach them good habits, and other people aren't. And so there's still a ton of unfairness. I never found the sort of fairness argument for equality of opportunity all that compelling because of the sort of genetic lottery problem. The argument I find more compelling is that equality of opportunity just leads to better outcomes overall compared to trying to make the outcomes equal. And I have some uncertainty around that, but that's how you would get me on board with the libertarian paradise. I don't deserve all the credit for that because I wish I could remember his name, but a historian who wrote an op-ed some years ago, basically pointing out like actually the team of rivals, like the cabinet that Lincoln formed after he was elected president, in which he put all of his political rivals, the people who'd run against him for the Republican nomination. That's not a great example of the principle that it's always used to uphold, like that it was used to illustrate in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, that, it's good to have dissenting opinions in your inner circle so that you can, better solve problems together, because it actually went terribly. And, 3 out of the 4 rivals, like either contributed nothing or like actively undermined Lincoln until he finally got frustrated and like fired or ignored them. And only one of them was like a partial success in that he helped Lincoln by giving him dissenting opinions. But this is not the success story it seems to be. Anyway, so I read that op-ed and I was like, interesting. And then I went and checked what this guy was saying and realized it was true. And so I just have this sort of side tangent in my book about how, the idea of it's an impressive story for other reasons, because Lincoln kind of had the equanimity to do this maybe politically advantageous thing of giving his rivals political positions, and he was able to deal with it much better than most people would. But it's not a good example of how to, learn from opposing perspectives. Because if the people that you're engaging with are people who like actively hate you and don't have any kind of camaraderie with you or shared premises, or, don't even think that they're fighting for the same thing as you, it's going to be really hard to learn from those people in useful ways. And you should instead be looking for people who have substantive disagreements with you, but who you have at least a little common ground with, who, you respect their intelligence or scholarship or their character, or, you're fighting for the same thing to some extent. Maybe you just disagree about how. And those are the areas, the really rich veins where you're likely to actually learn from opposing perspectives, as opposed to just finding the guy who's yelling at you from across the aisle and trying to learn from him. And not just to pay lip service to that, but to actively, thank and praise people who do venture a disagreement, because that's what people are watching. They're not just listening to your words in which you say, of course I welcome disagreement, because those are often hollow and people are right to not take that at face value. They're watching what you do and how you actually react when people disagree with you. And so it really is important to lead by example. And then I would also say there's a fair amount that you can do that to discourage anchoring. Like if you're making a group decision, a thing that often happens is one person tosses out an idea, and then for various like social reasons, everyone kind of latches onto that and they're like, yeah, great, we should do this, right? Any disagreement? And you can often avoid that pitfall by having people independently like write down their opinion or their guess before you start discussing it. So at least you have a record of what people thought independently before they heard other people's ideas. So I've done that with colleagues before. I find that really helpful. There's all these different pitfalls in group decision making, but that's one of them. As far as I've seen, the evidence suggests that social media doesn't have a huge impact on people's voting decisions. That there's a lot uh, there's a lot of like sharing and reinforcing of opinions, and a lot of like I would find it much easier to believe that social media helps increase polarization and distrust of the other side than to believe that social media actually causes people to vote in ways they wouldn't otherwise have voted. I like reading Kevin Drum. He used to write at Mother Jones, and now he writes at Jabberwocky.com, I think is anyway, it's called Jabberwocky. Just look for Jabberwocky and Kevin Drum. And one thing that he keeps emphasizing is that social media companies get criticized a lot for allowing the spread of misinformation, and especially like divisive misinformation. But Fox News is far more responsible for this than social media companies are. Like if you look at the effect sizes, and he was like, it's weird that, Biden the other day like condemned Facebook or maybe all social media companies for
Facebook is
allowing the
killing
spread
people.
of misinformation about vaccines or COVID. Yeah, but Fox News has done far more towards that than Facebook has. And it's, I don't know, maybe tech companies, I don't know what it is, either that tech companies are sort of a popular scapegoat now, or possibly it's that the people saying things like this think tech companies are more malleable. Like we might actually be able to influence them to change more than we'd be able to influence Fox News. And so that's why we're harping on them more. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I definitely don't think they deserve as much blame relative to other actors like Fox News as they get. For a lot of people, we're like, well, it's not quite so crazy to think that there's a conspiracy of, elite pedophiles. The tricky thing, though, is just that there's often a leap made from the genuine conspiracies to far more crazy conspiracies that I think is not justified, where I'm like, okay, yes, the Tuskegee experiment, in which, officials in the 20s, 30s,
30s and 40s,
lied to Black patients in Tuskegee, and claimed they were treating their syphilis when they actually weren't. That was horrible, obviously, and I think that should increase the probability you put on, nefarious lies from the government to some extent. Like the fact that was long ago, I think should weaken the strength of the evidence, or weaken the update you should make about conspiracies today. And it's sometimes used to justify like, well, Tuskegee happened, therefore it's reasonable to think that like the CIA created COVID and is now infecting everyone in the country with it, or something. Like, to me, that's like way too big of a leap to make. And the existence of Tuskegee does not provide much evidence for the plausibility of that conspiracy theory. But it's hard to articulate to people, how much it's reasonable to update. There's not like clear-cut rules, and it's more of a like, I know it when I see it, that people are updating way too much from, the conspiracies that do exist. I wish people tried harder to be specific about like who's getting the punishment for which crime, and like there's a lot of, these people did something terrible and weren't punished, so we're going to punish this person, or we're going to give this person the benefit of the or acquit this person as sort of indirect payback or something. And I don't feel like the scales of justice balance that way. But the interesting thing for me is that I also don't think, from what I've read, the implicit associations test is just not. It's just pretty shoddy, and we should not be relying on it or basing training on it or anything like that. But at the same time, I think that implicit bias is like probably quite common and real and impactful in a lot of ways. And that's just like based on sort of common sense, real life experience, and like watching how people react to things, and even doing thought experiments myself. Like sometimes I'll do a thought experiment where I imagine like hearing the same speech from someone, who's a different race or a different like socioeconomic class, or, different gender or something. And I do notice like, oh, I'd be like more inclined to give that person the benefit of the doubt, or I'd be more skeptical or something. And I don't think I'm like, way more racist or bigoted than average. So I assume if I notice like these differences in my implicit reactions, they're probably pretty common. So like, it's an unusual position I often take, where I'm like, my best guess is implicit bias is probably pretty common, but also I think the implicit associations test should never be cited and is not good evidence of implicit bias. They must have some polls about that, but I from whatever I've seen, it's gone way, way, way down. Like, a tiny fraction of what the numbers used to be for being, opposed to interracial marriage. Or my sense is that people are very unwilling to acknowledge that there's been a lot of progress made on these like explicit kind of dramatic indications of racism, like explicitly opposing interracial marriage. That they're unwilling to acknowledge that because I think on some level they fear that would undermine the other point that like there's still a fair amount of implicit bias that matters that we should be trying to get rid of, or there's still a fair amount of like racism after effects of slavery or Jim Crow or racism baked into our systems that is important to address, and that they won't be able to make that point compellingly if they say that like it is better that people are no longer mostly opposed to interracial marriage. That's a hard rhetorical knot to untie. I remember a freshman class I took on Israel and Palestine. It was taught by a Palestinian professor, and one sort of section of the class was about sexism or misogyny. And the whole point of the like readings he chose and the discussion he led was that Israeli society treated women much worse than Muslim society, and he picked he picked some examples of sexism in Israeli society. And like in any society, you're going to find some sexism. So he found some, examples of gender discrimination at Israeli companies. And then he also picked some examples of like Palestinian women. I forget now, it's been too long, but Palestinian women talking about how fulfilled and respected they were or something. And I just remember being just boggling that he was trying to make the case that it was better for women in Palestine than Israel, and I think I can only assume that he. I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze him, but my best guess is that he felt like there was the current state of discourse was too anti-Muslim when it came to women's rights, and not appreciating the problems that women face in Israel enough. And so his way of pushing it towards the truth was to go too far in the other extreme, try to make the opposite case. And maybe on some level he felt like that was the most truth-seeking thing to do, because then people would be pushed more towards the accurate truth. But anyway, I bring this up because I see this kind of thing a lot where people make a kind of implausibly exaggerated case that I feel like on some level is them trying to push against an exaggerated case in the opposite direction. And it's just an unfortunate equilibrium we fall into, where people feel like they have to, stretch the truth in one direction to compensate for other people stretching the truth in the other direction. Then people react to that, and it's just a big old mess. It's very tricky when you have people claiming that the state of society is good and they don't want to change it, and you really, really suspect that they would feel differently if they were, had more education or had more autonomy or had experienced the alternative, that they would, choose differently. And, as someone who really values individual autonomy and like really wants to avoid coercing people, this is especially tricky for me because you have these two potential risks to individual autonomy. There's like the women whose autonomy is being trampled on, and they're claiming, no, this is how things should be. This is how I want things. Don't change it. And so, you want to give them more autonomy, but you also don't want to violate their autonomy by giving them more autonomy. And it doesn't feel like there's any sort of way to err on the safe side. The only heuristics I can really rely on are like, I'm more inclined to just trust someone that they want things to stay the way they are. The more freedom they have to actually make that choice, and the more information they have. Like, because it's not really a free choice if you don't have all the relevant information. And so never easy call to make, but I would be more inclined to go against someone's wishes if they had very little information and very little freedom to make that choice. I am confused about how to define free will. I feel like the conversation is confused, and the reason it feels hopelessly confused to me is that any way of talking about free will seems to lead to a contradiction. Like, if we say that, well, we don't have free will if we're subject to the laws of physics. I mean, I can't imagine a even conceivable universe in which we would say that we had free will. Like whether our actions are followed, deterministic processes, or whether they're non-deterministic, any way you can imagine it, we would look at that and go like, well, but it wasn't really free will because, things resulted from prior states of the universe, or, well, it wasn't really free will because it was just determined randomly. Like, so to me, that thought experiment where you imagine the universe running differently and ask yourself, well, then would I consider us to have had free will? And never is the answer like, yes, that would be free will. That to me indicates that there's something wrong with the way that we're thinking of the idea of free will. But I don't know whether the conclusion from that is that we don't have free will, or that we should just abandon the concept of free will altogether. We're not talking about free will in the sort of like, pure philosophical sense, and we're just talking about like, how much autonomy do I have as an individual to direct, like, to control my destiny? Then I think there are like degrees of free will in that more colloquial sense.
Degrees of freedom,
degrees of freedom. Maybe if we avoid the phrase free will. This is one thing that I really loved about the book The Robots' Rebellion by Keith Stanovich.
Oh, I don't know that.
Which I've plugged elsewhere. So I don't agree with all of it, but basically he talks about the kind of fast and slow thinking that Kahneman talked about several years later in Thinking Fast and Slow. And Stanovich's point is essentially, a lot of our judgments and decisions are the result of this kind of automatic, fast system one thinking. And if we start to rely more on this sort of deliberate, careful, slow system two thinking, then we are actually taking more control of our own destinies, because we're essentially like, the metaphor of the book is that humans are like robots that were built by our genes over the course of many, many millennia. And by becoming more self-aware of our own thinking and how we form our judgments and how we decide what to do or what to want, by becoming more self-aware, we're like robots who are rebelling against our creators and saying, no, I want to direct my own life based on my own goals as an individual and not based on what my genes thought would be best for me or wanted, which was, their own proliferation. I'm not saying it as well as Stanovich did, but basically it caused me to think about metacognition, about like being more aware of how you think about things and how you're forming your judgments in the first place. It caused me to see that in this kind of exciting terms of empowerment, that like, by becoming more aware of our thinking, we're taking control of our own destinies and not just following whatever automatic course our genes kind of laid out for us. And I find that so inspiring. I'd have him, and this would be an entertaining experiment regardless of whether it helped. I'd have him try to get the Israeli and Palestinian representatives to pass each other's ideological Turing test, which is, it's a phrase coined by Brian Kaplan that I talk about a little bit in my book. So in its pure form, the way you pass an ideological Turing test is by explaining the other side's position, like why they believe what they believe, or what they want and why, explaining it so well that an outsider couldn't tell whether they couldn't tell that you don't actually believe it yourself, because you were able to explain all the details and also to articulate it in a way that's not like a caricatured straw man. So like if you're a liberal talking about like what conservatives believe, and you say like, well, yeah, conservatives believe that poor people are all terrible and deserve to die. Like, no one would believe you're actually a conservative when you say that. So you would not pass an ideological Turing test. And so, being able to pass the other side's ideological Turing test won't necessarily make you agree with them or like them, but it at least forces you to confront the kind of straw man that you had of their view, and to recognize when things are more complicated or nuanced, or sometimes more reasonable than you thought they were. So then you can actually disagree with or engage with the real thing that they think and not your straw man of what they think. So that would be an entertaining thing to watch.
That would be great. Yeah. No, that's actually be a great way to start. I bet they'd have a hell of a hard time doing it though, because the other side would go, "No, that's not what we're arguing. That's not what we believe." Okay, let me try it again. No, yeah. You're still getting it wrong. It is hard to do. All right, Julia, thank you so much for coming on the show. Give us an idea. What are you working on next? What's your next big project?
I don't actually know what my next big project is. I've kind of just been taking it easy, doing a lot of publicity for the book, and working on my own podcast, Rationally Speaking.
Oh, yes, that's right. Good. Yes, people should check that out.
Yeah, that's right. yeah, if you like this podcast, I think there's a reasonably high probability that you would also like Rationally Speaking.
Adjust your priors.
And yeah. And then, I mean, one project that I kind of want to go back to that I've been doing before COVID is what I was calling the update project, where I was trying to figure out best practices for getting experts with differing opinions to understand each other's models and hopefully update a little bit collectively in the direction of truth. So I felt like I was making some pretty good progress on that, and then COVID hit and made it hard.
Yeah.
But I definitely want to pursue that direction again.
I love when I hear people, just average people that know nothing about any of this stuff, go, "Oh, I'm updating my priors." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So this kind of Bayesian reasoning language is kind of infiltrated.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not
culture.
officially Bayesian.
Yeah,
and sometimes people grouse at me like, "Well, it's you're not like technically doing Bayesian updating. You're just changing your mind," which is, yes, it's a colloquial adaptation of the term I'm borrowing. But I do think it's like a valuable way to think about changing your mind.
Yeah, totally.
And way to think about incorporating evidence that works better than just saying like, oh, I should change my mind sometimes. So anyway, I talk about that a lot too. I have a YouTube channel, if you look for me on YouTube, where I talk about, I kind of defend the value of like the colloquial meaning of Bayesian thinking against its detractors. So you can check that out.
We'll put links to all that down below in the show notes. Julia, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for the great really interesting conversation. Super fun, interesting.
Michael.
That
likewise.
that hour and a.
Oh wow, yeah, so it did.